Um, and I will ask the audience to just wait till the Q&A session at the end to post your questions, and they will be addressed in the last approximately 15 minutes of this session. And please post your questions in the Zoom chat, or you can unmute yourself to interact with the presenters. And if you have any questions after this session ends, you can post them on Whova in the Q&A session, or send them directly to the presenters through the messaging feature on Whova. And so I'm going to actually skip the demonstration since we're already a little bit behind. So without further ado, let's welcome our first presenter, Mami Oyamada from the University of Pennsylvania. And the title of her presentation is Japanese Third Culture Kids Learning and Meaning Making Processes in Online Tutoring Interaction. So, Mami, I will make you co-host so you can share your screen.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to let you know that I've pre-recorded my presentation because I might have a bit of unstable internet access. And I'm also in Japan, so I thought, might be safer that way. So if that's okay, I'll share my screen. You can just give me a few seconds. Okay. Can you see my slide? Okay, great. So I'll go ahead and play it. It's about 14 minutes long. Project on Japanese third culture kids learning and meaning making processes in online tutoring interactions. So before diving into my project, I'd like to briefly explain a central term, third culture kids. So third culture kids, or TCK, was originally coined by sociologist Ruth Useem in the 1960s. She originally described them as expatriate children who have built their own third culture by bridging the home culture of their parents, the first culture, and their host or second culture. More recently, in the past few decades, Pollock and Van Recken have published multiple editions of Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds. And in the book, they explore common themes and issues experienced by TCKs worldwide, including benefits like nurturing an international perspective and language skills, as well as challenges like rootlessness and losing a sense of belonging, and psychological issues, even like depression and trauma. And so turning back to what led me to this project in the first place was actually my ongoing work as a part-time staff for a Japanese tutoring company called TCK Workshop. The mission of this company is to provide mainly academic, but also mental support to such Japanese children who in Japan are often referred to as kikokushijo, or those Japanese TCKs who have already returned to Japan after living abroad, and kaigai shijo, or those who are currently living outside of Japan. And also identifying as a TCK myself, growing up in the United States for most of my childhood, I thought this would be a great opportunity to work as an intern and pursue my personal, academic, and professional interests in exploring the learning experiences of various tutees. Also, in terms of the research literature, there seems to be little to no research exploring specifically Japanese TCK's learning experiences in fields like second language acquisition and bilingualism in particular. So based on my 2.5-month summer project, I argue that meaningful learning is co-constructed by both the tutees and tutors utilizing their unique communicative repertoires. Communicative repertoire can be described as the collection of ways individuals use language and other means of communication, as well as an accumulation of habits and norms used for effective communication. And specifically, what seems to be a common thread in the tutoring sessions is the fact that tutees and tutors share their common ties to Japan or their interests in Japan, while also acknowledging that not knowing something is a norm, whether that's in their first language or second language or whatever other language is that they know. And so in terms of the method, I chose to take on a repertoire approach to classroom discourse analysis, which is basically an approach that focuses on how participants' communicative repertoires play a role in 3 dimensions of their discourse and educational context, namely the social context, interactional context, and individual agency. And these dimensions all intertwine. The bulk of the data comes from recorded tutoring sessions between a tutee and tutor, conducted either on Skype or Zoom. I also conducted semi-structured interviews and questionnaires, which helped to see the big picture or the social context, like individual biographies and experiences of mobility in relation to the interactional context of tutoring sessions. On the right here is a basic profile of 4 focal pairs. I had the opportunity of observing 10 times each over the summer. And for the sake of time, today I will share with you excerpts from 2 pairs, starting with Ken and Sally, and then Tomo and Mika. So let's start by taking a look at Ken and Sally's tutoring session, where they've read aloud, or they're reading aloud an English news article titled Shang Dynasty, China's First Recorded History. Ken has just finished reading a paragraph and Sally asks him whether he has any questions about the vocabulary he encountered. And I'm actually going to share with you a transcript along with the audio, which is a little less than 2 minutes. So if you could bear with me and follow along, and I will take you through the main points of analysis afterward.
So, vocab words?
Tomb.
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 Yeah, it's one of those weird pronounced words. It's a long O. I wonder if drawing a line above it will help. Tomb. So a tomb is the place where people are buried.
Ah.
Not a grave exactly, but a more like it's more like a monument or like a large area. So for example, Egyptian pyramids, as far as we know, are tombs. Or what else?
How about the Japan? There's a big like a keyhole thingy.
Keyhole tombs.
Like it looks like there's a circle on top and a triangle.
Wow, these are huge. Yeah, these are tombs. I wonder. I've never seen this before.
It's in Japan. It said they were gonna bury. The king wanted to bury his when he died in that place.
Yeah. And then they just built a city around it.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's obviously a lot going on here, but to highlight some of the main points in this interaction.
So,
sorry about that. First, we can see in turn 10 how the tutee seems to have this aha moment and attempts to raise a point. And in the process, I think we can see several pauses as he attempts to get his point across. It's also interesting to note how, although a bit unclear, he mumbles to himself in Japanese what sounds like kofun period, kofun jidai, or a particular time period in Japan related to what he subsequently explains as a keyhole thingy. And the keyhole thingy at first seems a bit abrupt and off topic, as it isn't mentioned anywhere in the original article. But the tutor immediately picks up on it and recasts it as a keyhole tomb, and also typing. Although I wasn't able to see exactly what she was typing in the moment, her enthusiasm in turn 15 suggests that she probably looked up images of the keyhole tomb and figured out what it was, probably looking something like this. Also, when we look at ties to Japan, we can see how the tutee starts and ends this part of their conversation by referencing Japan and what he knows about it. And the tutor, although briefly, utters an informal O in Japanese, suggesting how she's aligning with the tutee culturally and linguistically. And last but not least, individual agency seems particularly salient in turn 16 as the tutee shares his own knowledge. So the big picture here is that Sally and Ken clearly have different backgrounds and this varying communicative repertoires. However, it's interesting how they seem to complement one another, as Ken's repertoire is enriched by learning a new word tomb, while Sally also learns about keyhole tombs. So ultimately, they use an pick keyhole tomb and use this Japanese reference and Japanese, although minimal, to learn with and from each other. The next example is from Tomo and Mika's tutoring session. And in this session, they're going over a past language arts exam actually used for admitting Kikokushijo students to a competitive private Japanese high school. Here, they're going over a problem that requires the student to write the correct kanji or a Chinese character of a word written in a more simplified Japanese writing in a reading passage entitled Natural Architecture. You can see the original, the simplified, the Japanese and the problem on the top right here, and the Chinese characters kanji on the bottom left. Tomo has incorrectly written out the homophone of soki, as you can see here on the PDF and the one on the far left down here. And in blue on the PDF, you can see how the tutor wrote the correct form, also pronounced soki, during the tutoring session that I did observe. So moving on to the excerpt, I'm not going to play the audio this time. Here, the tutor is trying to confirm the tutee's understanding of his own written answer. And in the process, there are clearly several instances of Japanese, as well as a Japanese word, interestingly being pronounced as if it's an English word, jukugo. It's also interesting to know when you look at just the form and how they're using English by default. And the only time that Japanese is used or it starts being used is when the tutor initiates it. And this part's actually a few lines after the preceding excerpt, where now they've transitioned to talking about the meaning of the correct answer. And while looking at images of the building mentioned in the passage along with the word, the tutor starts to explain how it almost resembles a temple in Nara or Kyoto, historic cities in Japan, neither of which are mentioned in the original passage. Then you can also see here some more translanguaging of Japanese, as well as the English translation of soki, conjures up. And interestingly, the tutor candidly asks for the tutee's input on her own explanation and understanding of the English meaning. And the tutee immediately follows up by sharing his knowledge of the word, which then leads the tutor to thank his confirmation. The social context here is that Tomo and Mika have relatively similar repertoires, as they've actually both spent significant time growing up and going to school in the US. And as the excerpts demonstrate, they have the flexibility of translanguaging, but also being comfortable using English as their default language as a result of this larger scale nature of English being globalized, and particularly for elitist people. At the same time, this is obviously very challenging as they're working on a purely Japanese language arts exam. That's difficult and quite detached from the immediate sociocultural context and learning experiences of the tutee in his everyday life. So this detached nature, unfortunately, is actually a very common source of difficulty for many Japanese TCKs that I've interviewed and in general. So key takeaways. Based on this project, what I think we can say is that overlapping communicative repertoires are undoubtedly beneficial, but they aren't the defining factor in shaping meaningful learning. Oftentimes, differences can be stimulating and lead to new perspectives in learning. We can also say that dialogue allows tutees to expand and share what they know, and this should be encouraged as much as possible, even if it includes wait time in between. As tutees are often trying to convey a point that connects the learning content, their lived experiences. And past research also shows that in EFL and EFL and ESL context. And last but not least, we need to address and solve the gap that often exists in testing and lived experiences, not limited to the entrance exams for Kikokushijo, but other standardized tests administered worldwide. Before I end my presentation, I'd like to share with you a reflection on one's time in high school in Hawaii, made by one of the most recognized world leaders of our times. He's often raised as an example of a famous TCK, although there is no public record of him identifying as one. So here's his quote. "It was as if, because of the very strangeness of my heritage and the worlds I straddled, I was from everywhere and nowhere at once, a combination of ill-fitting parts, like a platypus or some imaginary beast, confined to a fragile habitat, unsure of where I belonged. I didn't talk to anyone about this, certainly not my friends or family. I didn't want to hurt their feelings or stand out more than I already did. And this quote is from the former US President Barack Obama. Rather than arguing whether Obama is a TCK or not, my point is that individuals, including but not limited to TCKs, are going through very complex subjective experiences as they navigate the world around them. And I think it's worth thinking about and wondering how many others are actually out there who are bottling up their anxieties or feelings about their roots, their identities, their languages, and their cultures. And so I hope this presentation led to some new insights and that we can all work together as educators, researchers, practitioners to help support and leverage these individuals' rich life experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Mami, for that presentation. From here, we are going to, everyone please hold your questions and we'll move on to the next presentation. So let's welcome our second presenter, Gabrielle Constantine Durasi from Rutgers University. And the title of the presentation is Challenging Dominant Language Ideology in the Adult ESL Classroom, a Case Study. So let me give you co-hosting powers. And you should be all set to share.
Everybody see the PowerPoint? Let me just move your images on a different screen so I can see my own presentation. Okay, so today with you, I'm presenting the case study Challenging Dominant Language Ideology in the Adult ESL Classroom, and it's a project that I did last year when I was completing my master's. So this is a brief outline of what we're going to do today. Introduction, I'm going to talk a bit about the data, method, going to spend a lot of time on the analysis of some excerpts. Lastly, discussion and conclusion and the references at the end. So the premise for this project was that while hegemonic discourse, so discourse or discourses of power that we encounter in society often enters education, specifically the context of the classroom, both students and teachers have the potential to challenge the status quo instead of reproducing it. And within this framework that I developed this project, language functions as a social identification tool. Also, we know that language is ideologically saturated. And what language ideology implies is that we praise certain practices and we perceive them as superior, while others in turn are degraded and they're considered deficient. And we see this in many fields and in many aspects of our life. And I think education is one of those fields where it becomes very apparent that we do hold these ideologies of language. And for myself, who I am a language teacher, I think it's very important to consider and discuss these ideologies as they affect us as educators and just affect society at large. So language ideology consists of beliefs about language and language use. More importantly, and linked to this presentation, this project, it links linguistic practices to a predetermined social order. And there is definitely a big intersection of language practices and other identifiers that people might display other identity factors. But here we're going to focus on ideology. And it grants privileges to some, but not to others. And in the United States, which is the context in which I led this research, the predominant language ideology is the standard language ideology, which Lipke Green defined as this bias towards an abstract, idealized homogeneous language, which is imposed and maintained by dominant institutions. It is such an abstract idea that no one actually communicates in standard language. However, it is assumed to be this ideal form that we should all engage to and communicate. And it's linked to better outcomes and to discrimination if you don't use it. So there is a lot to be said about standard language ideology. And in English specifically, we have standardized English as the appropriate form of the language. For this project specifically, one review that was very important for me was Spanish Song, because they identified that the two most prevalent language ideologies in American education are the belief in language standardization and the belief in monolingualism. So this is very interesting because the United States, other than the fact that English may be the mainstream language, but it's not an official language in its constitution, it is a very linguistically diverse country. So the belief in monolingualism that is imposed and supported and perpetuated through American education actually is pretty disconnected from the reality that we experience in our society, which is a very multilingual society. And moreover, Silverstein coined this as the culture of monoglot standard. Specifically for this project, the experiences that occur within educational settings were of particular interest to this study. And my research question was, how did teachers' practices reinforce or challenge dominant language ideology? So for this case study, I observed a Genevieve, an adult ESL instructor, and I collected data over 3 lessons in 2 different classes that she taught. And it was a multimodal project. So I had multiple sources and modes of data, questionnaire, the observations. I had an interview with her, and then different teaching artifacts that Genevieve kindly provided, such as textbooks and other learning materials, there's teaching materials that she prepared. So this was an ethnographic study. And basically I transcribed the interview. I coded the data, which comprised the interview and the field notes. And I coded it for instances of talk about multilingualism, language variation, and standardized English. And I then categorized them as either reinforcing dominant language ideology or challenging it. And my methodology was informed by critical discourse analysis, which examines how certain practices uphold the status quo and privilege those in power. We're going to start with the analysis of the excerpts that challenged dominant language ideology. Overall, Genevieve displayed openness towards multilingualism. She allowed her students to code switch, and she expressed positive attitudes towards language variation. And just to quote something she said when talking about her own ESL students, she said she thought of them as very brave. She mentioned this a couple of times. The fact that, and she viewed them as their own individuals more than just her students, acknowledging their struggles. The majority of them were immigrants who had moved to the United States and for various reasons, but she acknowledged who they were and where they were coming from and their own individuality. And her comment that they were brave was very important. Okay, so in this first excerpt, what do you say in Spanish? So Genevieve initiates this conversation, this exchange in Spanish. I'm losing my voice. I have what you say in Spanish, but then we see she code switches from English into Spanish and uses the Spanish name for the virus that she has. I guess virus is not the best thing to be talking about these days, but it was the flu in this case, and she decided to name it in Spanish. She also tells us prescriptively, oh, I am going to code switch, why you say in Spanish. So this is a very short excerpt, but it's relevant because it shows that she is herself aligning with students' practices. She is code switching in front of the class. She engages in multilingualism herself, and she shows affiliation with what students do on a day-to-day basis. Now moving on to our second excerpt. The context was students were doing pair work together. So Genevieve was just walking around and she addressed a group of students, asking them in line 2 if they were almost finished. And then as we see in line 3, a student took the initiative and responded casi casi, which in Spanish translates to almost almost. And then Genevieve in line 4 recast the students' answer and says casi casi as well. Why this is an interesting exchange is we have English as the language in which Genevieve initiates this exchange, then followed by Spanish, the student's choice of language. And then Genevieve in line 4 maintains the student's choice of language and recasts their answer in their language of choice. This is a interesting exchange because it's an IRF sequence, an initiation, reply, and feedback. So it is very interesting. While it follows the more or less regular format of classroom interaction where the teacher, initiates the exchange, the student replies, and then the teacher closes the exchange with their feedback. What is interesting is that in her feedback, she maintains, as I said, Spanish as the language of communication. And keep in mind the context of this exchange. This is an ESL class, so she could have easily just offered a translation, not as a way of disengaging with the students' multilingualism, but just to simply state that this is a class where they should try to practice their English. Instead, she didn't. She aligned again with their practices. This is an excerpt from the interview. So I asked her if she thought it was appropriate to code switch or use multiple languages in the class. And as we see in lines 3 and 4, Genevieve self-identifies as the teacher who allows it or even encourages it. However, it's important to notice that this favorable viewpoint is juxtaposed with several hedges, I wouldn't say, also followed by in line 5, I don't know what's best. So we see that she's taking a bit of an ambiguous position here between self-identifying as the teacher who allows this, even encourages it, but then also hedging her own response. I wouldn't say, I don't actually know what's best. However, in the end, she does kind of close this answer by saying that it's okay to code switch, is fine. So even in the end, after producing this semi-ambiguous opinion, she still says that it's okay to code switch. Then when, for the last expert for challenging dominant ideology, asked her if she taught her students the standard language, if she only taught her students the standard language, and she said no. What you hear in the subway or online at the supermarket, it's a lot different from what you hear in a university classroom. So definitely, I help them to learn whatever they want to know, whatever will help them in their daily lives. She gives a very spontaneous definition of language variation. What you hear in the subway is a lot different from what you hear in a university classroom. So we have different, we use language differently based on the context. And then in lines 7 and 8, she kind of reaffirms herself as this educator who's working for and on behalf of her students. I help them to learn, right? Whatever will help them in their daily lives. Finally, just one excerpt for reinforcing dominant language ideology. It's the only excerpt that I could identify where she reinforced this ideology. She brought up the native, non-native dichotomy. Again, keep in mind the context is an ESL classroom, so we're going to deal a lot with this construct of native, nativeness, non-native. So she says, a lot of native speakers who speak this language, she's addressing her students. A lot of native speakers who speak this language since they're little don't know how to use these words. If you know these words, your vocabulary will be better than that of most native speakers. Here she's trying to provide a innocuous, we might say, advice to her students of having the vocabulary will be good and you'll be good at this language skill that you're trying to develop. However, even if inadvertently, she still positions the native speaker as the authority for linguistic practices. So even further, she has this comparative better than. So it reinforces the idea that non-native speakers have to always aim and try to become this idealized version of the native speaker and have to emulate their practices. And there's this unwritten competition between the native speaker, who is considered the standard, and this superior example of linguistic practices and a non-native speaker who's just trying to get there. Finally, discussion and conclusion. So overall, Genevieve resisted the ideology of monolingualism as I showed she viewed students' multilingualism as a resource rather than a deficit. She engaged herself in code switching and multilingual practices. She displayed a favorable stance towards incorporating language variation in the classroom. However, at times, her position was ambiguous. I only presented one excerpt in this case, but there were several that I identified in throughout my observations throughout the case study. And what was definitely an instance in which she reinforced this dominant language ideology was the assumption that the native speaker is the authority for linguistic expertise. I have to mention one main limitation of the study is that the interviewer, in the interview, the teacher, so Genevieve, might have reported practices that did not reflect her actual teaching arsenal. So there is potential disconnect between teaching beliefs and teaching practices, which leads to the importance of data triangulation. So I think it was good to have the observations to complete the interview and see if there was a disconnect. However, my data is limited to only 3 sessions that I observed. And obviously, future research on this topic should adopt a longitudinal orientation that would allow us to observe these things over a longer period of time. And that is it. These are my references.
Thank you.
And thank you. I will stop sharing. And I believe I need to make you the co-host, or?
Oh, I'm already the co-host.
Oh, okay.
So thank you again for sharing your research, Gabriela. And our third and last presenter is Allison Horan from Columbia University. And the title of the presentation is Bimodal Bilingualism and Code Blends in Non-Native Signers. So let me just make you the co-host and then you can start.
Great, thanks.
Okay, you have the power.
Thank you. All right. So my topic is on bimodal bilingualism and code blends in non-native signers, as Sarah said. So a few definitions to start, because this topic, unless you work in signed languages, a lot of these terms are probably new for a lot of people. So bimodal bilingualism is fluency in both a signed and a spoken language, or fluency in 2 modalities. In the case of this data, it was American Sign Language and English, but this would apply across spoken and sign languages. And then the other key definition would be code blends. This is similar to code switching, except it's when both languages are produced simultaneously. So in code switching, as I think we saw in Gabriela's presentation, there was a switch from English to Spanish. Here, it's where sign language and spoken language happen simultaneously, and that is a code blend. So my study was a reduplication study of a later study than this. So this is the original study on which another study was based, on which my study is based. Vanden Beauregard and Baker, 2005, did research on codas, which are children of deaf adults who generally have both signed and spoken languages as equal first languages, learning spoken language outside of the home in school or with family members who are hearing, and learning signed languages with a deaf parent. So this codas, this was the topic of their research. They examined the interactions of codas and identified 4 main types of code blends that were observed in their data. The first was an English-based code blend. This is where English was the primary language of the utterance. And then any signs that were happening simultaneously didn't add any new information, nor was it a complete utterance in the sign language. The reverse of that is the ASL-based code blends. These were where ASL, American Sign Language, was the primary language of the utterance, and any simultaneous spoken utterances added no information and were not complete utterances. The next would be a full code blend, and these were where the information was fully expressed in both the signed and spoken language simultaneously. So the utterance was complete in both languages, and both languages were equal in what they said. And then the last area was mixed code blends. And this is where both languages presented unique information. So they were both complete utterances, or sorry, not necessarily both complete utterances. There's at least one complete utterance in one of the languages, but the supporting language or equal language was adding information that wasn't in the other. Then Bishop 2011 looked a little deeper into the mixed code blends that Van den Beauregard and Baker found and identified two types of code blends, and that was elaborative code blends and evaluative code blends. So these were both instances where both a signed and a spoken language were produced simultaneously and offered up different information. So for elaborative code blends, the two utterances, one language was providing information that was unclear in the spoken language. And I'll provide an example of that in a second to help clarify it. But basically it means in the spoken language, there was part of the utterance that was unclear, so the sign language clarified it, or vice versa. Evaluative code blends are when the simultaneous utterance in the other language expressed judgment on what was being said. So if I said something verbally, but signed something that was casting judgment on what I had said. And again, I'll show you examples of these in a second. So let's move into the examples to give you a better idea of what I mean by these. So I'm pretty sure they were hearing. This is fully expressed in English, and the signs that happened simultaneously were just sure and hearing. Didn't provide any new information. The signed utterance was not a complete utterance, so this was considered a code blend in which English was the primary language of the utterance. An ASL-based code blend, you'll see here, they signed cute plus deaf, poor pity, which translates to she's cute, deaf, and poor, what a pity. But the English that went with it was just cute plus deaf, poor, la 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 la. So as you can see, that English utterance, not a complete English utterance, it doesn't make sense in English really, and it's just reiterating what was said in the signed language utterance, which is a complete utterance. Sorry, just for clarification on the transcription, top line is English, bottom line in all capitals is the sign language utterance transliterated. So it's the written version of each sign. A full blend here, you're not getting one, and fully signed, you not get one, you're not getting one. So it's fully signed in both languages. This is considered a full code blend where neither language is dominant. Moving into the mixed code blends. Evaluative code blends, again, these are where you are putting judgment on something. So are we talking about 10 years ago, but while I signed 10 years ago, or while I said 10 years ago, they signed long time ago, indicating that there is that judgment of 10 years ago is a long time. They're not saying 10 years ago is a quick time, it's a long time. So it's adding this evaluative judgment to what was said spoken. The spoken alone does not tell you if they think 10 years is a long time or a short time. So this sign supplements that by adding that judgment information. And then the elaborative code blend, this is where one utterance is unclear and the other modality supports it. So in this one, it was a lot of this, and they signed connection. So this is unclear. Obviously, if it was just that spoken utterance, it wouldn't be clear, but signing connection simultaneously elaborates on that spoken utterance. It provides new information that wouldn't be there without the signed utterance. So my study, Van den Beauregard and Baker and Bishop 2011 both looked at codas. These were individuals who had sign language and spoken language as shared L1s or similarly developed L1s. I wanted to see if these patterns and frequencies that they were found were also occurring in people who learned sign language later in life, who learned it as an L2. So it's a small scale study, but these were all individuals who learned American Sign Language as a second language, but used it regularly in both work and social settings. So there were 3 participants. One was a sign language interpreter who obviously for work used sign language as part of her job and spoken language, and then also socially used it. Participant B was an audiologist who worked at a school for the deaf. So was using sign language at work pretty regularly, she was hearing, but also was married to a deaf man. So at home was using sign language and spoken language. And then participant C was an early childhood intervention specialist who specifically worked with deaf youth and their parents, had a vast deaf social network. So all of these individuals were using sign language regularly, but had learned it later in life. This was not an L1 for any of them. I think the youngest was participant B, who had learned sign language, started to learn sign language in high school, and that was the youngest of starting to learn sign language. So all of these participants basically copied the setup of the Bishop 2011 study. So all of my participants were put in a room together and arranged so that they could see each other and hear each other easily. They weren't given any direction as far as what language to use or what was being looked at, but they were told that they all spoke sign language. So they all knew going in that everyone in the room spoke sign language. That was all that they knew. Participant C was given a list of prompt questions to help guide the discussion, and then the interactions were recorded and transcribed. So the results, the data analysis, what I found. So the blue is the frequency in the Bishop 2011 study, and the orange was what I found working with non-native signers. So if you look, English-based code blends were about the same in frequency. These were the most common for both groups, both participant pools. ASL-based code blends were the least common across the board. But ASL-based code blends were more common in the Bishop study with native signers than they were with non-native signers. Full code blends, as you can see here, this again was where both utterances contained the full information and were complete utterances in both languages. Full code blends were far more common with native signers than with non-native signers. And then the opposite was true for mixed code blends, where they were far more common in non-native signers than they were in native signers. And I'll talk a little bit about why this might be. So to give you an example from my current data, an elaborative code blend. So one of the participants was saying, good luck, while signing, opening and closing the door. And she was talking about how she, a friend of hers was pregnant, and if she was like leaving, she would like open the door for them and say good luck. So she was like showing the action of what she would be doing while wishing them good luck. So elaborating on that. Here's an example of an evaluative code blend. They were talking about the ways that English was taught to deaf students, the oral method, if they were taught to read lips and to produce sounds instead of sign language. And she was talking about the drill and kill method of teaching. And she signed again, kind of adding that judgment of monotony and it being so repetitive. So basic notes on the findings. So ASL-based code blends were a lot less frequent for non-native signers than they are for native signers. And this, I think, probably has to do with the fact that it is a second language for them. So comfortability is probably going to be to fall back on your L1 instead of your L2, which is probably why this happened. There was also an absence of something called coda talk. And this is what a lot of the ASL-based code blends were in Bishop 2011. Coda talk, it's a reminder, coda is child of deaf adult or the native signers, is when you speak an English utterance, but use ASL grammar structure. So it's using the grammar structure, and basically if you had glossed a sign language sentence, saying that out loud. If you remember back, cute plus pretty poor, la la la. That would be an example of a coda talk. And so this was not present at all in my findings, which might be because it is generally referred to as coda talk. It's only been observed in codas, and my study reinforced that it was not present in non-native signers. And the last thing I wanted to put out was the discrepancy in the amount of full code blends. And this might be a pattern in education. And I want to talk about something called SIMCOM. SIMCOM is a shorthand for simultaneous communication. And in a lot of interpreter education programs and deaf education programs, they'll train interpreters and educators away from using SIMCOM, which is using both English and sign language simultaneously. And a lot of education programs will tell students that one language will lose out if you try to use both simultaneously. There are different grammar structures. There's different ways to structure a sentence. So if you try to do both, you won't be able to do this. So this is frequently said in many interpreter training programs, which two of the three participants had gone through. So I theorized that it's possible this training method might have dissuaded these individuals from using full blends or using sign language and spoken language simultaneously. Some quotes that led me to believe that, you know what it means to me is lesser language, in reference to SimCom. Another one, it's not two languages, it's not ASL and English. And when you do them at the same time, you just get this mush. So throughout the conversation, they happened to have these, which led me to believe this might be why full code blends were more common in native signers who might not go through interpreter training programs than those who go through interpreter training programs. And I think I am out of time, so that is me.
Okay, thank you. So we have a few minutes. I didn't take into consideration all the talking I did at the beginning, so I'm going to shut up and open the floor for questions for any of our presenters. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or to unmute yourself.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh, Katie? Can you unmute yourself?
I was gonna just say I wanted to thank all three of you. I really related, I think, to all three. I particularly with the tutoring one, I work at the writing center as part of my TA-ship, and so I'm working with a lot of international students all the time, and I feel like we end up teaching each other things a lot. So even though I am actually married to a TCK, but I'm not a TCK, I still think it can sometimes happen between cultures too, that are, and I thought that was very interesting sort of to think about, especially the two students who had both grown up in both countries and everything like that. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I also work as a Spanish interpreter and I am at a deaf school a lot. So I see kind of the three languages happening at once, and sometimes when they have not, this is sort of the opposite, but when they have Hispanic parents who speak Spanish at home, and then they're mixing English, Spanish, and signs. So I've seen kind of a lot of mixes. So yeah, I didn't know if you guys I guess this is kind of a question for all three of you, all three of the studies, but it seemed for all of you, building rapport was the best way to kind of I guess to battle against the language ideologies, or yeah, I guess I'm not really sure if this is a question or more of a comment, but just your thoughts.
Should we go in order to answer, or if, yeah, I'll start. So thank you for the comment. It's great to know about your personal experiences, and you mentioning how you're obviously familiar with TCKs based on your personal life. But yeah, I think I agree with what you just said. And especially through my paper, I think what I try to push and argue is that, yeah, building rapport is actually really important. And without it, I mean, I think without it, we really can't engage with each other. And that's something that, I don't know, I feel standard ideologies and the, I guess basic teacher student kind of teaching structure usually kind of dismisses or kind of overlooks. And so, yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah, I would say for me too, this whole idea of rapport was important. Also, I am myself an immigrant who's moved to the US only 6 years ago. So I definitely came into my project with a lot of personal interest there, especially with the whole idea of the native, non-native. So I think for me, it was interesting because I was observing the teacher, but I actually built more rapport with the students. I wasn't focusing on the students, but because there were more identifiers between me and them. So it was very interesting how I actually ended up, I guess, relating more to their experiences than those of the teacher.
For me, I think, yeah, as the participants kind of got to know each other and were more comfortable throughout the data collection, the longer it went, the more code blends they were using. So I think the more comfortable they got with each other, the more comfortable they were switching between languages and using both languages.
Yeah, it was like interesting how like like Spanglish is more used among like native speakers than it is if you've learned Spanish as a second language, and it's kind of the same in the deaf community. So I thought that was pretty like interesting too.
Just a note, it is 4:35, so technically this panel is ending. However, there's only one other simultaneous panel going on. And then the next panel to start actually starts at 5. So we can hang out here for a little bit if anyone wants to talk more about the topics that the presenters covered. Or, if you need to take a break or need to leave, feel free to do so. So I have a question. This question is for Mommy. So I think the phenomenon of TCKs is pretty common in multiple countries. And I know like it's especially in Japan and South Korea, but I wanted to know if there's since there's like tutoring for returnees, if there's also maybe like courses or like curriculum for heritage learners of Japanese in Japan. I know that heritage classes are they're not uncommon in the US for Spanish speakers, but I want to know if there's some like equivalents in Japan.
Right. Thank you for the question, Sarah. And I just want to clarify. So like, you mean physically in Japan, like those heritage classes, or you mean like for Japanese, like maybe children living, or maybe Japanese American children like living in the US?
In Japan.
Oh, okay. I would say, I guess it kind of goes back to, how we define like heritage language too. And through this research, I didn't really explore that in too much depth. So, I might have kind of a different approach in terms of like understanding that. But when I think of heritage, I usually think of, children. I mean, they come from, say, if they're of Japanese heritage, and if they're heritage learners, then it's not necessarily like their, dominant language, and like their parents might, their parents might like definitely use the language like, as their first language. But I think as like a child, probably like living, in different communities and maybe not like, learning it, or like, we're sorry, not learning it, but like not using it right in everyday life, but just kind of if they do have the opportunities, like learning them through those, classes, right? Like maybe community language classes and things like that. So that's what I have in mind. And there are definitely a number of those kinds of schools in the US that are held like on Saturdays, I believe, but only in like most of the time in like the more urban areas, and where there are concentrated like populations or communities of like expatriate Japanese, people. Yeah, so I personally, when I was growing up, like I lived in 2 different places in suburbs outside of Detroit, Michigan, and Nashville, Tennessee. And in Detroit, Michigan, there were a lot of Japanese people. As if you know about history around Detroit and things like that, there were a lot of Japanese people, especially in the late 90s, 2000s. And but in Nashville, Tennessee, like, it was a completely different, it was like a different experience, very few Japanese people. I didn't have, there wasn't any like, Japanese school for heritage learners or, other, I guess, like Japanese TCK children. So I was pretty much homeschooled. I was there for like 6 years throughout like my elementary school, middle school years. I mean, homeschooled as in like I went to American public school. So that was my like, thing. But yeah, sorry, I think I'm rambling, but yeah, in Japan, it's more of if you're Japanese, then you're Japanese. And I think the country kind of has different expectations depending on, like your citizenship and nationality. And so, yeah, I think it really depends on, where you are and how you identify, how the country identifies you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for answering my question. And I know that Lal has to leave soon, but if anyone has any questions for her, burning questions. Okay, I have a quick question if you have time. So I believe you talked about ASL and simultaneous, I think you called it SimCom, and the kind of like in education or training programs, there's kind of this like don't do that sentiment. Do you think prior to some of those education programs or people who may have been trained in more informal programs have that same sentiment, or do you think that's a bit universal?
I am not 100% sure of that. I would say if you're learning anecdotally and informally, you probably won't have it pressed upon you as hard. But it's, I think, something that's pretty commonly expressed within the deaf community. And there's people who are deaf, lowercase d, who cannot hear, and then there's the deaf community, capital D, which is culture and language. And I think within the capital D deaf community, it's a pretty widely held opinion that SimCom, you have to be specifically trained in SimCom. There's very specific settings where it's appropriate, but for the most part, if you're just having a conversation, it's not really an appropriate means of communication. So I'd say even if you're learning it, informally from friends and family, anyone who, if you have any sort of tie to the deaf community, you'll probably hear that messaging.
Okay, thank you. So I don't want to keep you too long. So we'll probably end the session here. If you have any other questions for the presenters, please post them on Whova's Q&A section for this presentation. And thank you again to all of our presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.